You are listening to the Break Time Tech Talks podcast, a bite-sized tech podcast for busy developers, where we'll briefly cover technical topics, news snippets, and more in short time blocks. I'm your host, Jennifer Reif, an avid developer and problem solver with special interest in data, learning, and all things technology. This week, I'm highlighting a couple of tool experiences that have been positive overall, hopefully adding a bit of positivity to your week and maybe some happy vibes as well. The first one is GitHub Actions had a version 3 deprecation and they were migrating to version 4. This deprecation is a hard stop and it does close out on December 5th. So this was a major thing that needed to be upgraded, and unfortunately my website uses GitHub Actions in the workflow, so this had to be done, and so I started looking at this week, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. The second one is that IntelliJ IDEA, which is the IDE for coding and writing Java programs, had some updates for an AI coding assistant feature, and I'll talk more about that as well. Let's get started. The first thing is that GitHub Actions is going from a version 3 to a version 4, and the deprecation is killing support on December 5th, which means that you must upgrade to version 4. You must migrate. This process to migrate was surprisingly painless. I use GitHub Actions in my jmhrife.com website where I blog and I kind of document my speaking engagements and kind of what I do. And I use GitHub Actions to build the website and publish it to the webpage. I always kind of tease that there's one fix on my website every year that causes a rabbit hole of work. This, I am very happy to say, was not one of them. I had that earlier in the year. I was thinking this would probably be one too, but it actually wasn't. It was really, really easy. The repository I had followed and used in my setup had actually updated its version as well from v3 to v4, and so everything was already up to date for me. I just needed to pull in the updates to that source repository. The README in that third-party repository included the latest versions, had the updated documentation. I'll link that as well. But it was super easy to do this. I updated my YAML file for my website. I pushed it to GitHub and I watched the deployment. It ran successfully, which was awesome. So surprised and thrilled. And I went out and I tested my website and everything still works. So I actually just upgraded the actual dependency from v3 to v4, ran the deployment, everything works fine. I have had very few developer experiences where it is that simple and just that out of the box, you're up and running without any pain. I also have not forgotten about my blog. I'll be working on another blog post soon, so I hope to have that up too if any of you are wondering about that. But I was just really thrilled, and kudos to both the third-party library that uses GitHub Actions as well as GitHub Actions for making this process so seamless. Then also, I have a little bit of a, wall I bumped into this week that I was using the @ID annotation in one of my applications, and I got some feedback on that there's a little bit of differentiation between using just the @ID annotation, which actually references the internal Neo4j ID, so the internal ID for the entity itself inside the database, which is not best practice to reference that. Same thing with like MongoDB documents. They don't want you using those internal IDs. Same thing with Neo4j. You can also use, though, a UUID generator, which is really nice. It generates a unique code, basically an ID for you to save with that entity in the database and use that as your unique key, basically. There's a couple of different variations of this provided in Spring Data Neo4j, like a string generator as one example. The other alternative, if you need to create custom IDs or you're coming with external ID values, then you need to use something like optimistic locking, which means that you create those IDs, but you use an @version property and make sure that the database in Spring Data Neo4j is checking the database to ensure that it's not overriding something that it shouldn't be. It shouldn't assume that you have a new entity when it's kind of going against the database. It will do this optimistic locking, checking for the version numbers before it does anything to make sure that it's not doing something it isn't supposed to. That was something I kind of bumped up against. Just beware. Using @ID references the internal ID of the entity itself in the database, which is not best practice. So it's much better to use something like a UUID generator, where it'll generate the unique ID, or something like optimistic locking, where you can ensure that it's not creating duplicate data when you're using custom or external key values. The second update I wanted to talk about today is the IntelliJ IDEA Code Assist feature. The Code Assist feature actually, or AI Code Assistant, if you want to call it, came out earlier this summer, and I really noticed it late in the summer, maybe early fall, August, September-ish time area. And I started noticing it pop up when I was developing and demoing as well as I was presenting at various conferences. Some people really love AI coding assistants in their IDE, and other people really dislike them. I actually kind of like them, but I do think that, as with everything, moderation is probably key here. I did notice these in IntelliJ IDEA. I think they appeared in the 2024.2 release, which was released this summer. It is really, really helpful, but I have noticed it's really easy for me to hit the wrong key and pick the wrong suggestion. For instance, there's a code completion in the editor, and then there's the AI assistant. And those two things sometimes will suggest different variations of the same thing. So one will kind of reference maybe something you've coded before, where the other one will kind of predict what it thinks the code should look like. And sometimes those vary just a little bit. Sometimes I've noticed one or the other being right nearly all the time. And so you have to be really careful about whether you're hitting the tab key or the enter key for which one you're choosing, whether that's the AI coding assistant or the autocomplete feature. Just be aware of that when you're coding and you see these maybe auto completions pop up. You need to make sure you're hitting either tab or enter, and depending on whichever one you hit, that's going to pick which solution you are choosing. I found this really helpful for the most part. I use the AI coding assistant a lot live demoing, which can be a huge help or a hindrance, but I found this mostly helpful as long as you are paying attention. The thing is, when you are really in the zone and you're trying to type something really quickly, you're not paying attention, and you just hit tab or enter or whatever the key is, you can choose the wrong thing, or it misses some things and you don't realize what it's missed until you're several lines down, or you're going back and trying to test it and it's failing for some odd reason. I would still recommend, it is an assistant. You still have to really pay attention to what you're doing and kind of just spot check it as you go, and think through what you're writing and what it's trying to do for you. It also remembers things that you consistently use and often prompts with those methods, which is really, really helpful too. If I've coded something multiple times and I'm going back through and doing it again, or demoing it, or doing another example app, it will kind of remember the things that I often type and just kind of follow along with that. Again, some people love them, some people hate them. I'm kind of in the camp that I'm appreciating its usefulness, at least for right now. And I am looking forward to seeing how this improves over time. This week, I was able to devote a little bit of time to catch up on some things, which led me to upgrading the GitHub Actions. I really wish more developers and libraries had such a seamless upgrade process. Then I've been meaning to chat about my experience with IntelliJ's AI Coding Assistant feature, and I'm looking forward to continued improvements in this area. As always, thanks for listening and happy coding.